All right, we are back on the Young Turks, and I want to talk to you about what I think was one of the most important pieces of legislation in a long, long time. That's the National Defense Authorization Act. Unfortunately, it was a disastrous piece of legislation, and we've talked about it many times here on the Young Turks. And some supporters of the president say, well, it was okay that he signed it because there was an exemption for United States citizens. Because what the bill does is it allows for indefinite detention without trial at the military's discretion. Now, one of the things that was changed was to allow the president to also have discretion. Ooh, still the executive branch. But the section that everybody points to is in 1022. It says the requirement to detain a person in military custody under this section does not extend to citizens of the United States. And people say, see, they put that into the bill. That means the U.S. citizens cannot be indefinitely detained. Unfortunately, that is totally wrong. You have to be well-versed in the way they write these things. It says the requirement to detain a person in military custody does not extend to citizens. In other words, it's an option that the president has and the military has. If the president wants to detain U.S. citizens, he can. In fact, President Obama, in his signing statement, acknowledged it. He says, again, this sounds good, but I'm going to tell you why it's bad. He says, I want to clarify that my administration will not authorize the indefinite military detention without trial of American citizens. Indeed, I believe that doing so would break with our most important traditions and values as a nation. He continues to say, my administration will interpret Section 1021 of the bill in a manner that ensures that any detention it authorizes complies with the Constitution, the laws of war, and all other applicable law. That sounds really good, right? Wrong again. No, it says, my administration will not authorize it. That is an acknowledgement that other administrations can. So he's saying, I'm choosing not to detain U.S. citizens indefinitely without a trial on my watch. Trust me, maybe. But future presidents can do anything they like. It's acknowledged in the signing statement. By the way, what the hell is President Obama doing a signing statement for? Remember what he said during the campaign? He said, I will not use signing statements to nullify or undermine congressional instructions as enacted into law. You know why? Signing statements are unconstitutional. You don't get to say, hey, you know what? The legislature passed the law this way. I signed it, but I won't do some of the parts I don't like. That's not how our system works. So civil libertarians are not just disappointed, they're outraged by this. This is not just my interpretation or some law professor's interpretation. It is the consensus among lawyers that care about this issue that this is the case. For example, Amnesty International says, once any government has the authority to hold people indefinitely, the risk is that it can be almost impossible to rein such power in. President Obama has failed to take the one action, a veto, that would have blocked the dangerous provisions in the NDAA. In so doing, he has allowed human rights to be further undermined and given al-Qaeda a propaganda victory. Now, that is very tough talk, but it's true. Why are we letting al-Qaeda dictate the way we run this country and undermining our constitutional rights? It's an outrage. The ACLU agrees. They say President Obama's actions today is a blight on his legacy because he will forever be known as the president who signed indefinite detention without charge or trial into law. That's Anthony Romero, executive director of the ACLU. Now I want to welcome in Hina Shamsi, who is also with the American Civil Liberties Union, to talk about this issue. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to just start out by saying, look, obviously strong statements by your executive director. Jonathan Turley, law professor, says this can't be undone. This is hideous. One of the worst pieces of legislation he's ever seen. I mean, it could, of course, be undone by other legislation, but not by a signing statement that says, I probably won't do it. So are we overreacting here, or is it as bad as it looks?
Well, we're not overreacting, but I think we want a little bit of clarity here. It is true that there is a provision in there, 1022, as you pointed out, that mandates military detention or creates a presumption of military detention for certain categories of people, mainly foreign al-Qaeda suspects, including possibly foreign suspects captured in the United States. There's another provision, 1021, which is the broader military detention provision, and we believe that that provision does not authorize the detention of U.S. citizens captured in the United States or legal permanent residents captured in the United States. The issue, though, is that the Bush administration used very similar authority and language, which 1021 purports to incorporate, to argue argue that it could hold an American citizen captured in Chicago, a U.S. permanent resident picked up in Peoria, indefinitely without charge or trial. And so the danger is not just what this administration says, and President Obama has said that he's not going to use these provisions against American citizens, although he's pointedly not said anything about legal permanent residents or foreign residents, but what a future president can do. And you know, Cenk, I think that our concern should be obviously for U.S. citizens, but it should be broader. It is also about the rule of law and due process and the message that America sends to her enemies and her allies when it says we're committing ourselves down a path that violates our democratic values, that falls foul of what our founders promised in the Fifth Amendment, which is that all people are entitled to due process of law before they're deprived of their liberty. And we're heading in a direction that gives comfort to our enemies and alienates our allies.
So I want to ask you specifically about the Jose Padilla case. Remember, of course, everybody, well, you remember, I don't know if everybody does, that Jose Padilla was a U.S. citizen that was held in the United States without trial for a number of years, which I thought was the most outrageous thing that had ever happened. The rest of the media seemed to go along with it, like, yeah, sure, of course, why not arrest U.S. citizens and not give them a trial? So does this legislation allow future presidents to be able to do the same thing, but now under the cover of law?
We believe that it does not because it doesn't specifically say so. And the reason for that is that when Congress purports to deprive Americans of fundamental rights, and what right could be more fundamental than the right to liberty, then it has to clearly say so. And in this legislation, Congress does not clearly say so. And I think that's in large part because of an amendment introduced by Senator Feinstein towards the latter part of the congressional debate, in part because there was such an outcry amongst grassroots people, not just on the left, but also on the right, about the prospect of this indefinite military detention of U.S. citizens. So we don't think it's authorized, but again, the Bush administration used similar language, and certainly there are those who argue that the law is unclear. The Supreme Court did not rule in the Jose Padilla case. The Supreme Court didn't rule in the case of Ali Al-Mari. And so the concern remains that because this legislation has been passed, that it could be used against American citizens and others.
Yeah, to me, it reads that they have the option to be able to do it. If they ever do it and you guys are going to go to court and say, look, you shouldn't do it because of this law, because it's vague, because it has to say, hey, we have the option to do it. In another part, it says we're not changing the law. They did it purposely murky, the Feinstein Amendment that you're talking about. Then Godspeed in doing that in court and trying to fight for people who are detained. But the way I read it, it says that the president has the option to do it, and I think it's an absolute disaster.
Well, Cenk, I think that the reality here is that it's a disaster, yes, because it is codifying, big picture, right? Let's step back. It's codifying indefinite military detention without charge or trial for people captured far from any battlefield as part of American law for the first time in American history. And that is why this is a huge step backwards for civil liberties and why it in fact does not, as I said before, make us more safe, because it essentially militarizes our counterterrorism policy even when law enforcement and our federal courts are the proven better alternative.
All right. Hina Shamsi is the director of the ACLU's National Security Project. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And by the way, the law also does not allow you to bring back detainees from Guantanamo into the United States. It's got so many terrible provisions. So this actually leads into our first ever Media Watch. So we're going to focus on CNN here. The National Defense Authorization Act is something that has been considered for weeks and, in fact, months at this point. It has been debated. The president threatened to veto, and then he decided not to veto it. Senator Levin said he introduced some of the provisions that wound up being the most noxious, including the possible detention of U.S. citizens. We have covered it many times on this show. Yet we were surprised to find out that the establishment media is not covering it very much at all. In fact, in this entire process, as they considered the law, they debated the law, the president issued a veto threat, and then he did not veto it. He signed it into legislation. Throughout all of that, the so-called most trusted name in news, CNN, covered this story 0 times in prime time. Not one story in prime time. Overall, they do 24 hours of news. In those months, they've mentioned it just 5 times. In 3 of the instances, it was in under 30-second mentions. Oh, by the way, the National Defense Authorization Act might take away your rights. Okay, let's move on. And in fact, they weren't even clear on that. Now, to be fair, there was one excellent interview that Natalie Ellen did with Jonathan Turley, who's a constitutional law professor that cares deeply about this. Credit where credit is due. That was nicely done. The other interview was with a law professor who seemed to be in favor of the bill. I don't know how they found a law professor in favor of this bill in the country, but leave it to CNN to give you that kind of nonsense balance. Well, almost all the civil libertarians believe that it's an atrocious bill, including the ACLU, Amnesty International, etc., but we found one guy that seems to agree with it. That's CNN's balance for you. The other 3 times, they barely mentioned it. In fact, one of the times they mentioned it, they got it totally wrong. Watch what Don Lemon says here.
The legislation includes a controversial national security waiver that allows the president to transfer a detainee from a military prison like Guantanamo Bay to civilian custody if he chooses.
That is not true. The opposite is true. The president cannot transfer detainees from Guantanamo Bay into the United States. Way to be the most trusted name in news. But I'm less bothered that they happen to get that story wrong. I guess they're so indifferent to the story that they didn't even bother getting that right. They're like, oh, who cares? Our civil liberties are being taken away. Just mention it in passing in like 15 seconds or so. I'm bothered that they don't cover it overall. Please stop with the weebles and do real news. All right, when we come back.